Hello everyone and welcome to Knit Bits. I'm Lois with Aussie Lozzie Knit Designs and we are going to wrap up our video series on gauge today, the All About Gauge series. I know I said before that I was going to be doing another sample video where we go through a pattern and see what it means to be off, but I felt like upon reviewing all the previous Knit Bits All About Gauge videos that we've kind of done that a lot. And I didn't need to redo that again. So instead, today what I wanted to do is just give us the key points from the series so that we can remember them and just do like an All About Gauge wrap up. All right, so before we get started, I did want to ask you that if you enjoy Knit Bits and you are enjoying this video so far, you can hit that like, share, and subscribe button. When you subscribe to my videos, then you never ever miss another episode, which is awesome if you like these little segments of knit learning. Okay, now we're going to review our knit gauge definition. So we define knit gauge as the amount of space that a stitch occupies, right? And the number of stitches in rows that are in a 4x4 inch or 10x10 centimeter square. That is our whole definition. We are using the stitch occupying space. That is, like, in my opinion, the real meat part of the definition, but to tie it into something that we actually use as knitters, I think it's good to use that 4x4, 10x10 centimeter square. All right, so now that we have it defined and we know what we're going to do, these are the steps that you should follow when you're making and measuring a gauge swatch. All right, so I've made this into steps, so let's do this. All right, so step one, you want to read your entire pattern. You should always do this. You should always read your entire pattern and then pay special attention to anything that seems like it might be complicated or tricky, anything that's new to you, if there's any new kind of stitch pattern or way that you move the yarn or something that extra that you have to do. That's what you want to watch for. Step two, you want to read the gauge information in the pattern, and you want to pay attention to things like, is it knit in the round, is it knit flat, and especially what the stitch pattern is that they're using to get gauge. Most of the time it's probably going to be stockinette stitch, but you don't want to assume that. You want to make sure that you actually read that gauge information. Step three is that you're going to plan out your gauge swatch. That's where you're going to take the gauge information from the pattern that's usually provided to you in a 4x4 inch or 10x10 centimeter square. You want to multiply that number by 2, and that is going to give you the cast on stitches so that you get a nice sizable gauge swatch. Remember, if the pattern is knit in the round, your swatch should also be knit in the round. And so even if they don't say that in the gauge information, like knit in the round, if the pattern is knit in the round, you are going to want to make your gauge swatch knit in the round, okay? And then, are there any confusing parts in the pattern that you highlighted earlier that you looked at and said, oh, I want to practice this. I don't know what that's going to look like. I'm not sure how that works. How can you incorporate those things into your gauge swatch? That's what you want to plan out, okay? Then step 4, you're going to actually cast on your gauge swatch. You're going to knit it up. And when you have at least 8 inches of fabric, of the kind of fabric specifically that's called out for in your pattern, then you want to bind off. And that's a very important distinction that I made there. The kind of fabric called for in your pattern for the gauge swatch. Because if you are incorporating other elements, which is great to do, you do want to make sure that you're knitting in just that particular stitch pattern called for by the gauge swatch in the pattern for a sizable amount. That way you can get your true gauge, okay? Step 5, you want to block your gauge swatch. Even if the pattern doesn't say block your gauge swatch, you should block your gauge swatch. Unless it says that the gauge swatch should be unblocked, which I've never seen, but let's pretend it does. If it says that, fine, don't block it. But you should really block your gauge swatch, because when you block, your stitches relax into the state they're supposed to be. It makes reading your gauge so much easier. It makes measuring your gauge so much easier. It helps the fabric to lay flat. And if you're ever going to wash this item, which probably you are, then it's good to go ahead and block it so that you get the true finished measurement of that item. So you'll get it wet, and then you let it dry, and then you'll measure when it's fully dried, not when it's wet. Okay, so step 6, we're going to measure our gauge swatch. So if you cast on stitches that were double the number from the gauge uh, information in the pattern, then this is really easy. If you've blocked it and you just have like your little rectangle laying there flat, get your ruler and then just measure at the bottom of the swatch, in the middle of the swatch, and at the top. And you already know how many stitches that is because you casted them. So you can measure from end to end. And again, from the bottom, the middle, and the top. And if there's differences in those numbers, which sometimes there are, then you'll want to do the average, and that's what your gauge is. Okay, I think when you do it this way, it gives you a much better understanding of what your true gauge is. And it also helps you just see that, oh, well, I didn't get gauge maybe here, but it averaged out. And that's what we're really looking for. All right, so you want to repeat that same process for the rose height. Um, you're going to take your ruler and just measure like the length of it and then count the rows. So if you were counting your rows or rounds while you were knitting, you might know that you have 44 or whatever. And then you could just measure on the left side, the middle, and the right side, or vice versa. It doesn't matter. But again, if they're different numbers, that's fine. You just like do an average and you're all good to go there. So if you did incorporate other elements from the pattern into your gauge swatch, right? Like you added the increased rounds, or you added the specialty stitches, what you want to do is isolate the swatch of fabric that is just in the stitch that was called for in the pattern in the gauge information. And so when you do that, maybe you won't have 8 by 8, or it won't be even or flat, whatever, that's okay. You can measure 4 or 6 or 8, whatever you have on your ruler, and count those stitches out manually. And you want to move that ruler around again. Move it around and then take an average. And that's going to be your true gauge. The same with the rows on this one. You're going to just go up and down and move around in your swatch to get a couple different measuring points and get that true gauge number. Yeah. Once you have measured your gauge swatch, you will be in one of 5 positions, right? You would have matched gauge perfectly. Whew. 2, you would have matched your stitches but not your row height. You would have matched your rows but not your stitches. And you have too many stitches or too few stitches. So we all hope, of course, that it's number 1, that we have matched gauge perfectly. And if that is the case, then be sure to do a 30-second dance party and celebrate your win, because it's always super, super exciting. But if you didn't, it is not the end of the world, right? We're going to take a quick look through all of the situations to see what to do in these different columns. So if you matched stitch numbers, but not row gauge, so you matched stitch gauge, not row gauge, it happens, right? It's actually not a super big deal, right? Especially if your pattern says things like knit, stockinette for 10 inch and garter for 2 inches, whatever. Then the pattern isn't so reliant on row gauge as it is the stitch gauge, so you can still proceed. If it is necessary for you to get row gauge as well as stitch gauge, you can try a couple different things. You could try a different knitting needle material. Word of caution, it may also alter your stitch gauge, but you can try that. And if you're knitting flat and your row height was too short, you may want to try the purl side. So like we're doing stockinette. So you knit one row and then you purl the next. You may want to try your purl rows being purled with a larger knitting needle. That's because a lot of us knitters actually purl shorter than we knit. It's very common. Don't feel bad about it. It happens. If your row height was too tall, you could try doing the opposite and knit with a smaller needle and try to bring your row gauge down to where it needs to be, right? All right, so if you matched your rows but not your stitches, now this is almost always, in fact, I can't even think of an example where this is not a problem, okay? It is 99.9% more important to match stitch gauge than it is to match row gauge. So if you didn't match stitch gauge, that's really important. We really need to work on that. And we'll go to the next examples. So if you got too many stitches, this means that your knitting is actually smaller than it should be. For many of us, that might seem a little backwards, but it's really not. It's not. So if you made more stitches in 4 inches than you should have, it's because they're occupying less space than they should be. Does that make sense? And so you want to try to find a needle size that's going to increase the size of your stitch, which will give you the right number of stitches. So in that case, you'll go up a knitting needle size, right? So if you're off by very little, you might want to consider just trying an alternative needle material. Or you could follow the size example that I gave you before. And if you haven't blocked that swatch, even though I told you to before, if you haven't blocked it, try blocking it and see if you get gauge. If you're super close and you did block, but you didn't like use combs or T-pins or anything, I would suggest blocking it with those. And then when you remove them, see if you get gauge. Like if it's off very little, blocking helps the knit item retain its shape. So it makes sense that if you're off like by half a stitch or something, that you could kind of block that issue out, right? Anyway, too much. Too few of stitches. So if you have not as many stitches in the 4 inches as the pattern says you should have, that is because your stitches are taking up more space than they should. So they're larger than they should be, and that means you need to go down a knitting needle size, right? Again, if it's a little bit different, you could try a different knitting needle material. And you could also, it's harder to block out too large of stitches because it's just too big. So you can't really do that, but you could try a different material if you're off by very little. And you could also, of course, go down a size in knitting needle. I'm going to wrap up this video and I'm going to give you guys a printable download that I created. It's just an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, so you can download it and print it and laminate it and keep it with your knitting. And it's going to have the knit gauge definition, so we kind of remember all the time what that means. And it also is going to have a table with solutions for if you don't meet gauge specifically, and actually only on if you have too many stitches or too few stitches, because that one seems to trip people up. And so that's okay. We'll just get ourselves a little cheat sheet to carry with us. And I just want to thank you all so much for watching Knit Bits. If you enjoyed this video, would you please hit like, share, and subscribe to my channel? That way you never ever miss an episode. And I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.